Hey there, art nerds. Today we're talking about the 24-piece Paul Rubens tube watercolor set. I received this set as a Christmas present from my mother, who purchased it off of Amazon, but I've had my eye on this set for a while. Fans of the channel know that I reviewed the Paul Rubens half pan set, which I got from AliExpress a couple years ago. I'll link that down in the description below, as well as in the cards. And I'd really like to do a head-to-head comparison at some point in the future, so I hope you guys will keep an eye out for that. So you can get this set on AliExpress and on Amazon. I'll link them both. And you can get Paul Rubens watercolors on AliExpress pretty easily. So back when I reviewed the half pan set, I wasn't that impressed, and I found them to be chalky and full of optical brighteners that make them appear bright in the pan, but then they're chalky on the paper. However, many chatters in the paint box really like the Paul Rubens tubes, so I was delighted to discover this 24 tube set beneath the Christmas wrapping paper under the Christmas tree. So a big thanks to my mom for giving me this set for Christmas. So this set arrived shrink wrapped in a large, well-made cardboard box. Obviously, this box is intended for gifting. And I very carefully used an X-Acto blade to slice the back of the box so that I could easily remove the shrink wrap, since it was on there pretty tight. This set is available in light pink and a darker blue, and I received the light pink. Sorry about that. There is some information on the back of the box as to what colors you're going to get. Inside, there is an informational brochure, a really nice Paul Rubens branded plastic palette, and then our 24 tubes. The box is a pretty sturdy cardboard box, and inside there is a flocked plastic tray to hold everything in place. While I appreciate the sentiment, now I have this huge box that I have to store somewhere. So me personally, if they could have found a way to kind of condense this packaging a bit, that would have been cool. But I do appreciate the inclusion of the Mijello style palette. These are 8 milliliter metal tubes, and they have all of the information that you're going to need on the tube itself, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So typically this set can go for around $55, at least last I checked, but check the description below, not only for the links, not only for an updated price, but also for a transcript of this review. The brochure is written entirely in Chinese, and it mainly seems to be the colors available from Paul Rubens. Now, one of the downsides to Paul Rubens watercolors is they're not commonly available in the US. I haven't seen them in any brick and mortar store. If you guys have seen them, let me know. I'm really curious, but I've never seen them in Plaza, in Jerry's, nor have I seen them in my local staple, David's Art Center down in Metairie. So the palette is a plastic Mijello style palette, and what I mean when I say Mijello is Mijello makes these plastic bulletproof they're supposed to be stain resistant palettes that are airtight. They have a silicone gasket on the inside, and they're meant to keep your paints open longer while you're painting, like keep them fresh and wet in between sessions. Now there's a compartment there off to the side. I'm not super sure what that's for, but we have this little plastic tool that could be used to scrape the pans, or it could also be used to remove the palette entirely, as you guys will see in a sec. And this might be useful if you want to completely clean out the palette or refresh the colors, or if you need to remove them from this palette for whatever reason. It's handy to have that. Now the paints are meant to go in vertically, which is a little bit different from the Mijello palettes that are quite similar to this, but otherwise they are very similar palettes. So if you already have the Paul Rubens paint, you can use them in a Mijello palette. It would work just fine. And the black flocking got all over everything in this set, so I had to give it a quick wipe down so you guys could actually see what it looks like. So the tubes are 8 milliliter metal tubes with a small plastic screw cap. and they're a little bit narrower than what we often see in Western watercolors, the 15 milliliter tubes. So they're more like Cotman style tubes where they're a little less paint and a little more narrow. This is pretty common for these larger sets, like my Holbein set, my Mijello set. They were like this, the smaller tubes. Tube information includes the series, so A, B, etc., color reference number, color name in Chinese, the color name in English, artist watercolor in Chinese, artist watercolor in English, a portrait of Paul Rubens the painter, the brand name, and the tube size. The color band is at the top. It's just an approximation of the color rather than a swatch, which you get with like golden acrylics, for example. The back includes pigment information, including what mineral or dye the pigment derives from, AP certification, and a barcode. Color opacity and lightfast information are in Chinese, but it's still readable if you know what you're looking for. And the colors included with pigment information, and again, this is going to be down in the description below, so don't worry if you can't quite keep up. But we have A203, which is titanium white. It's made with titanium dioxide, so they're using PW6. It is fully opaque, and it is 5 stars of light fastness. A232, brilliant yellow red hue, which is kind of like a peach color. And they use cadmium red, PR108, and cadmium yellow, PY15. So this is going to potentially be cancerous, so you want to handle it with care. They also have titanium dioxide, PW6. It is fully opaque, and it is 4 stars of light fast. A233, permanent lemon yellow. It uses azo dyes. PY3 is semi-transparent and has 3 stars of light fast. B252 Indian yellow, which use benzodines. That's PY83. It's transparent and it's 3 stars of light fastness. C255 maple yellow. It's titanium chromium, which is PBR24. It's opaque and it's 5 stars of light fast. B254 cadmium orange red. So that's a pyrrole color. So PO73. It's semi-opaque with 3 stars of light fast. D215 cadmium red. It's a cadmium metal, so again, you want to be careful with these. PR108, it's opaque with 4 stars of light fast. A223 puby red, it's a lake pigment, so PR48, semi-transparent, 3 stars of light fast. B213 magenta, which is a quinacridone, PR122, it's semi-transparent and 2 stars of light fast. A204 peach light, which is more like an opera rose, and that's a naphthol, and it's naphthol as PR146. It's opaque with 2 stars of light fast. B295 ruby blue, it's a cobaltous oxide. PB28 titanium dioxide, so PW6, it's opaque with 4 stars of light fast. B193 French ultramarine PB29, it's semi-transparent with 4 stars of light fast. And I'm going to be swatching these on the Paul Rubens cotton rag block. So this is a 100% cotton rag block. I recently reviewed it. I find that this block is great for granulating colors, and I figured this is going to be a match made in heaven. I'm going to continue to read the pigment information to you guys while we swatch. We have Sea Blue A306. It's a phthalocyanine. PB15 to a ratio of 3, semi-transparent with 3 stars of light fastness. A298 Indigo, this one's a hard one for me, ceftazidimine. And what's interesting about this is indigo is typically made, it's a dye, and it's typically made from the woad plant. So it's interesting that they're going with a pigment here. PV19 phthalocyanine PB15, carbon black PBK 6. It's semi-transparent, 3 stars of light fast. E292 turquoise light cobalt oxide PB36. It's semi-opaque with 4 stars of light fast. Mineral green B144. It's chromium hydroxide PG18, cadmium PY35, titanium dioxide PW6. It's opaque with 3 stars of light fastness. A168 yellow green phthalocyanine, so PG36 azo dyes, PY74. It's semi-opaque with 3 stars of light fastness. Emerald green light B162, which is phthalocyanine PG36. It's transparent with 4 stars of light fastness. Hooker's green brilliant C183, cobalt oxide, so PG17. It's transparent with 5 stars of light fastness. B275 Hatina yellow ochre, which uses ferric oxide, so PY42. It's transparent and 5 stars of light fastness. B315 Venetian Red ochre, ferric oxide PR101, and it's transparent and 5 stars of light fastness. Indian Red A355 uses ferric oxide PR101. It's transparent and 5 stars of light fastness. Cypress Burnt Umber B272 uses ferric oxide PR101. It's semi-transparent, 5 stars of light fastness. And Coal Black A340, which is carbon black, so it uses PBK7. It's opaque with 5 stars of light fastness. The tubes also include what those pigments come from, which is unusual but very welcome in this instance, so I thought I'd share it with you guys. Sometimes that information requires more digging, and I like that Paul Rubens just put it out there for us. So I went ahead and, as you guys saw, I filled the palette and I went ahead and swatched it. I'm actually going to do 2 swatches. So with the wet swatches, the colors were applied basically fresh from the tube and had a tendency to glob onto my brush. If you're painting with these, you're going to want to work with a palette, if only to ensure more even mixes. Most colors were prone to lifting. Cadmium red is strangely shiny, and many colors swatch fairly opaque. Many colors have at least some degree of granulation. So I allowed this to dry overnight in the closed palette, so not really dry. I wanted to test how well this palette maintained air fastness and kept these paints wet and easily reworkable. So here I am, shutting it for the night, and I'm going to re-swatch it the next morning. And I also want to point out that the paint used on this palette is kind of a metallic pink, so it's very cute. So here are the dried paints from our first swatch test. And here's the first lift test. So as I just mentioned, most colors are prone to lifting. I'm using a synthetic brush for this, and I'm not scrubbing particularly hard. I'm just wetting them a little bit and then dabbing at them with a paper towel. Cadmium red is strangely shiny, as I mentioned earlier, and many of the colors swatched opaque. And many colors have at least some degree of granulation. So these are a really nice match with the Paul Rubens watercolor paper because, as I mentioned earlier, this paper loves granulating colors. I also want to point out that if you guys enjoy reviews like this one, almost everything I review on the channel is purchased out of pocket. In this instance, this was a Christmas gift from my mother, and as you guys can imagine, these reviews can get expensive. So if you enjoy these reviews, if you find them helpful and useful, please consider supporting my work over on Patreon. You can find me at patreon.com/natosoup. Also want to mention that my amazing art nerds on Patreon are not only mentioned at the end of this video, so you can check out who's supporting my work, but they also receive early access to videos such as this one, as well as goodies like free line arts. So if you enjoy coloring, if you enjoy watercolor, or if you want to help support art supply reviews and tutorials, join me over on Patreon. And you'll find a link to that, as well as a link to my coffee in case you just want to send a one-time tip, down in the description below. All right, so it is the next day. It's time for our second round of swatch tests. So the container was closed and kept the paints quite fresh. I really didn't notice much difference in how these paints handled between one day and the next. The only exception that I noticed, and you guys will see this in a moment, is Venetian Red. It did seem to be less saturated and might need longer activation. That's something else with these. I didn't drip water onto them in advance the way I would with fully dried half pans. I assume this palette's job is to keep these paints wet and fresh, so I basically just went into them with a wet brush, and I really didn't have any reactivation issues. Now, I am curious about that cavity over to the side. Am I supposed to keep a damp paper towel in there? Am I supposed to keep a damp sponge in there? Usually when I'm working with tube watercolors, I just let them dry out in half pans, but let me know in the comments what that side cavity is for. Is it for a water brush? I don't know, but hopefully you guys do. So usually I'm not a huge fan of more opaque watercolors. I'm iffy about more granulating watercolors because I'm not a fine watercolor artist. I'm a watercolor comic artist, and I do a lot of illustration. So I tend to paint small faces. I tend not to paint big sweeping watercolor paintings. So keep that in mind when you're watching this review. I'm coming at this as a watercolor comic artist, and I'm reviewing these paints as an illustrator and comic artist, not necessarily as a fine artist. So your use case might be different. And that's actually something I think I bring to the table that's very unique to these reviews, because there are lots of other watercolor artists here on YouTube who review watercolors, but I don't think they're necessarily watercolor comic artists. So if you're a fellow comic artist, if you're interested in watercolor illustration and watercolor for comics, hopefully my reviews are particularly helpful to you, and hopefully I can point some things out to you guys that some of the other reviewers might miss because their goal isn't comics, their goal is fine art, or their goal is realistic painting, or we just have different goals. So in general, I've really enjoyed working with these watercolors. So far, I think they're very high quality. I'm very impressed. I was kind of dreading that they would be like the half pans were, but they're very different. They're a whole nother kettle of fish, and I'm really impressed with the quality of these paints. So of course, you know, some swatches, that's really not enough to tell whether or not these paints are a good fit for me. So towards the end of this video, I'm going to do what I call mud tests, which is basically where I layer the watercolors and try to see if they lift up, if they turn to mud, if they just kind of fall apart with repeated layers. And then in a future video, I'm going to put these to work on an illustration and see how they hold up in that capacity. So I hope you guys will stick around for that one. It should be coming up soon. So this is the Venetian Red that I'd mentioned. You see how it's just the mass tone swatch has better coloration. That's the swatch down at the bottom at full saturation, but the gradiated swatch is just really weak. I don't know why that particular color didn't activate as well as all of the other ones in the set did. I also noticed that the turquoise, the cobalt turquoise, has a lot of gum arabic. I had to kind of discard some of that gum arabic because it was getting in the way of putting the paint in the palette. And I applied the paint in the palette just by squirting horizontally, and I kind of like that. It's a little bit different from some of the other palettes that I've used over the years. And I don't normally talk about palettes with you guys because I'm a very simple woman, and a metal palette is usually good enough for me. So here are the dried day 2 swatches. I'm not going to bother doing a lift test on them because we did a lift test on day 1, and other than the Venetian Red, I didn't notice any difference in how these handled from one day to the next. Now, a few weeks will have passed between this swatch test and me doing the field test, so I'm definitely going to try and pay attention to whether or not the palette was able to keep those paints nice and fresh, or if they dried out over time. But they've been sitting in a closed palette since, so ideally they'll be nice and fresh. Something else I want to mention is that while I was putting these into the palette, I lost one of the caps, but I was able to replace it with a small Winsor & Newton cap. They're pretty much the same cap. So I wonder if there's some crossover manufacturing. I don't really know, but it's nice that it's not like this weird proprietary cap, and I just couldn't find a replacement for it. So another day, a fresh new day, and it's time to do our mud test. So normally I do mud tests in 3 layers, 1 layer per day to give it a fair chance to fully dry. So still working on the Paul Rubens cotton rag watercolor block. If you guys are interested in this block, I have a review. It's definitely out to patrons. It should be out on YouTube by the time you guys get this. So I hope you guys will look for that. I'll link it in the description as well as in the cards. And basically, I'm just working with whatever colors strike my fancy. I did not pre-activate the colors. I'm just going in with a large wet brush, and I'm just checking out how they handle on the paper. I noticed that the paper really loves wet into wet effects and creates beautiful diffused blends, while colors kind of glom onto my brush, and you definitely need to work with a palette, as I mentioned earlier, or a mixing surface. The first layer went down beautifully saturated with really satisfying color payoff. This is where I really fell in love with the Paul Rubens tube watercolors. I liked them during the swatch test, but during the mud test, I just really fell in love with the color. I fell in love with the granulation. I fell in love with the possibility of certain techniques with these watercolors. So this is what they look like dry. They're still pretty saturated. We still get good color intensity. I allowed them to dry overnight, coming back to them, fresh new day. So for day 2, most colors are still pretty open and very easy to pick up. I didn't struggle with activating any, but quite a few would glom onto the brush, same as the day before. This makes painting directly from the palette a bit more of a challenge, as you may get some flecks of intense pigment or just flat out paint onto your painting. Colors in general seem to stay put once dry, which allows for really nice layered effects. On this paper, the granulation is lovely. I'm going to move this to another room and allow it to dry overnight once it's finished. It ends up in my bedroom underneath a vent, so it gets good airflow. And I really love how some of the opaque colors glaze on top of more saturated colors. Ruby blue, for example, is really, really pretty glazed on top of pinks, oranges, and purples, because the sediment, when it dries down, the sedimentation creates this kind of misty, speckly effect. Not like mud, but like a haze over it, and it's actually really pretty. And I also just love how the colors diffuse onto this paper. They're just so soft. All right, so I'm gonna move this into another room and give it a chance to dry fully. And on day 3, we will revisit for our 3rd layer of the mud test. So this is what it looks like dry. I apologize if you can't quite see the speckling I'm talking about, but believe me, it's there and I really love it. It's really pretty. All right, so at this point, I introduced a bunch of opaque colors trying to make mud. I have a feeling, though, that they're going to dry down to granulating rather than just a muddy mess. So you see, I'm using like the mineral green, and I'm going to use the cobalt blue, and I'm also introducing, this is, I think, the peach light, but it's really more like an opera rose kind of color. So I want to point out yet again, just so we're crystal on this, there are a lot of chromium, there's a lot of cobalt colors in this. These are minerals that do have toxicity issues. They can cause cancer. I'm not telling you guys this to scare you, but I would not recommend giving this set to someone who still has a developing mind. So not for teenagers, not for super young adults, just because of all of the cancerous or potentially cancerous materials in these paints. Now, you really, unless you're licking the brush and drinking the paint water, you're probably not gonna get cancer from this, but you do want to work in a well-ventilated area. You don't want to like lean over and inhale it. You want to be careful not to get it all over your skin and all over your hands. You just, in general, want to use caution when working with any professional grade art supplies, but particularly those that have minerals or materials in them that can cause cancer. And I just feel like I really do need to point this out because I know my videos tend to skew to a younger audience. These paints are great. I highly recommend them. They are professional grade watercolor paints at a very reasonable price tag, but they're not a toy. And if you're looking for paints that are going to be safer for younger artists to use, I recommend the Sakura Koi paint, or even Cadmium paint, or the Mozart Komorebi paints. These are great, but not a toy. So after the mud test dried, I felt like it was truly a perfect example of why it's important to step away and allow your work to dry overnight sometimes, before deciding whether or not it's good or bad. The day before, many of these colors looked flat out like mud when they were wet, but now that they've dried, you can see we really get some lovely granulation, especially with the more opaque colors. You can really get some lovely misty effects combining the Paul Rubens paints with the Paul Rubens paper. And hopefully this close-up will help show how that granulation and that layering actually looks. I had so much fun with these paints, and the only reason I haven't started on the field test is the weather is just not conducive to that. So I hope you guys enjoyed this review. I hope it was useful, helpful, and informative. My verdict: these paints really surprised me. Originally, I was prepared to be disappointed, as I was in the Paul Rubens half pans, but I fell in love. Beautiful granulating colors that stay fresh and open in the specially designed palette. Quick color activation, brilliant color and saturation, and the ability to layer. Playing with opacity and layering is a lot of fun. If you enjoy a traditional Chinese watercolor palette, this 24-piece set delivers that and way more, creating a set inviting for Eastern and Western watercolor artists alike. Although this set was a gift from my mother, I'm familiar with the price, and I wholeheartedly feel that if you're newer to watercolor and you want to invest in a set that's affordable and high quality, this is a wonderful place to start. And if you're more experienced with watercolor, this particular Paul Rubens set has a lot to offer the experienced watercolorist as well. I don't want to put the cart before the horse just yet, as I still need to do a practical illustration field test with these, but I definitely see myself painting with these in the future and probably adding it to my best of 2021 list in December. So the pros: the price of this kit, the colors included in this kit. Tubes include pigment information and where those pigments derive, plus light fastness and opacity. Tubes are easy to use and high quality. The palette keeps paints fresh. The granulating effects of these paints, and despite the granulation, this doesn't turn to mud. Okay, so what about the cons? Not available at any brick and mortar store I've seen, so if you fall in love, you'll have to turn to AliExpress for refill tubes. But if these grow in popularity, that might change. And the weird flocking on the gift set gets all over everything, and the box, while beautiful, is bulky to store. But all in all, these have way more pros than cons. These are a lot of fun to use, and the palette works so well with these paints. I didn't even bother setting them up in half pans to see if I'd like that, because I really like the palette itself. I feel like this is a great value, and I hope to see Paul Rubens watercolors become more popular in the US. I would say get the tubes, but skip the half pans. The tubes are way better, a much different experience from the half pans. I highly recommend them, and I hope you guys will check them out. So if you guys found this review to be helpful, useful, and informative, give me a big old thumbs up. Let me know that I've done a good job. If you guys have any comments, let me know down in the description below. And if you know another artist who's on the market for good watercolor paints, do me a huge favor and send this review their way, particularly if they're a watercolor comic artist or illustrator. I do want to remind you guys just one more time that these are not paints for younger artists. These are not paints for children, and they do contain pigments that may cause cancer. So handle with care and treat them with the respect that a tool like this deserves. But other than that, I really love these paints, and I'm looking forward to doing the field test. As with most of the reviews on this channel, this was not a sponsored review. This was a gift from my mother, and all opinions are my own and based on my years of painting watercolor comics and reviewing watercolors. So thank you guys for watching, and see you guys soon.